I'm going to introduce our guest speaker tonight, and in order of importance, in ascending order of importance, he is my great friend, a national treasure, and he is Dr. David Starkey.
Oh, gosh. I thought I was getting a real introduction. Instead, I had Amanda Light rather than Amanda Full, which is a fairly extraordinary thing. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a very great pleasure to be here. The evening, of course, has become a little bit more serious than when it was first envisaged. The flowers that you're wearing, the funds that we are raising, the destinations of them, I think should be in all of our minds powerfully. Equally, the contrast between us and them should be in our minds, and our gratitude for it, and our awareness of the staggering difference of our history and theirs. This is not being self-congratulatory. We have no part in making our history. We are simply the fortunate legatees of it. We may be proud of it, but we are the passive recipients of it. It's not arrogance, it's simply gratitude. And I'm sorry to be serious, but I think in the current circumstances, to be talking without an awareness of that seriousness, of that tragedy, of that horror, of the rupture of everything that we in our complacency have taken for granted, frankly, is disgraceful. I don't want to spoil pleasure. We've all enjoyed it, and we shouldn't sacrifice pleasure, but we should be aware. So that's the background. We're raising money for the horror that we thought we'd put behind us. I am born in 1945. I never thought that the world would effectively revert to that. It has done. We need to be aware of why. We need to be aware to an extent of what we can do to defend ourselves, to defend them, to stop this becoming a permanent reversion. So, which is over formal, is heavy, is not exactly what one wants after a decent dinner and the odd glass of wine. I apologize for it, but I felt I could not speak this evening without saying that. Again, just so that we get a sense of what we're talking about, where, let's be truthful, whatever they are, the few pennies we raise this evening, where they will go. Why is what is happening there in the Ukraine so very different from Ashford, where you are, from Barham, where I live, from London, where I will go back to? What is it about? What one needs to understand about the Ukraine, of course, is it is in the middle of this vast European plain where there are no frontiers. There are no frontiers. This is a territory over which armies, hordes, Genghis Khan, whatever, and empires have fought for thousands of years with no conclusion. We are at this extreme contrast of an island with defined frontiers, with a stable history, with elaborate institutions which are now pushing 1,000 years old. They have none of these things. A stable sense of language, a stable sense of nationality, a stable sense of identity. They are simply forging these things. We did it 1,000 years ago or 500 years ago. That's the key difference. That's one difference. So let's get the sense of geography. Do we all realize, for example, that what we call the Ukraine is never called the Ukraine until 1945? Right? The area is effectively divided between two empires and one extraordinary thrust of a population eastwards. It's divided between the emerging Russian Empire centered on Moscow on the one hand, and the vast residual, we've forgotten this, Poland-Lithuania, for most of the later Middle Ages, is by far the largest state in Europe. And the area is fought over repeatedly. And then there's the other element, which is the spread in the north along the Baltic between two seas, remember. So you've got this vast featureless plain. To the south, there is the Black Sea. To the north, there is the Baltic. And along the Baltic coast, you get the steady expansion of the Prussian Knights, the Prussian League, the German speakers, with Jews occupying the towns and so on. So you get a totally extraordinary world of fluctuating frontiers. And Russia itself only becomes a recognizable state in the late 16th century. It, under the great Tsar Peter the Great, famously, of course, comes to the dockyards in the late 17th century, the court of Charles II, knocks around with peeps and whatever, and he conquers the whole area to the first of the great rivers, to the Dnieper, to the east of the Ukraine, and then the area to the west is conquered by Catherine the Great, and Catherine the Great's generals, Suvorov and whatever, take from another empire to the south, the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire, they take the Crimea and the lands along the Black Sea. So it's an area permanently fought over, unstable, no fixed frontiers. Lvov, which is the city we're hearing so much about in the extreme west of the Ukraine, within our lifetimes, with the lifetime of people here, you could have been born under Austria-Hungary. You could have got married under Poland. You could have had your children under Nazi Germany. And you could have had your grandchildren under the Soviet Union, and they could have gone back to Poland when you had your great-grandchildren, staying in the same place. Right, so that's the geography. To get a sense of where we stand in terms of our own history. I, this evening, am supposed to be talking about Henry VIII, which I will eventually. Henry VIII's younger contemporary is the first Tsar, Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible of Russia, the first person actually to call himself Tsar of Russia and to rule from Moscow. The resemblances between Ivan the Terrible and Henry VIII are completely extraordinary. Ivan the Terrible manages 2 more wives. He has got 8. Henry VIII only has 6. Ivan the Terrible is also a great composer, like Henry VIII. Ivan the Terrible is an author of notable letters. We're not quite sure whether they're forgeries or not, but then there was also a lot of debate about Henry VIII's love letters, which are absolutely certain to be true. Ivan the Terrible murders his heir and destroys his own dynasty. Ivan the Terrible is a vast religious reformer. He composes masses. He murders monks. The resemblances are completely astonishing. Why is the impact of Henry VIII on English history so completely different from that of Tsar Ivan? And those are the kind of questions that I want to address this evening. In other words, I want to contextualize the sense of personality, this extraordinary eruptive figure, which of course Henry VIII was, and I want to place him in this very, very different picture of an England which is an island, with frontiers, with a long-standing tradition of culture, of language, of institutions, in comparison with A Russia which, remember, Russia now is as old as England was in the reign of Henry VIII. Can we begin to register what that means? It's exactly the same point when you're dealing with Islam. Islam is as old now as Christianity was in the 15th century. See what I mean? And if we're to, again, what we need is a sense of parallel times. We need to read across from one time to another. So let's begin. The theme is, why does Henry VIII still matter? Because I believe, I would, wouldn't I? My income depends on it, that Henry VIII still very, very much matters. What does he do? What's remarkable about Henry, of course, is, and I think this may apply to many of us, he discovers himself accidentally and late in life. If Henry had had the world that he imagined, if Catherine of Aragon had produced the son that he longed for, we would, ladies and gentlemen, have never remembered him. He would be an unremarkable late medieval king who imagined that he was going to reconquer the English Empire in France and failed. The reason we remember Henry is accident. It is the accident of the failure of his marriage to Catherine of Aragon to produce an heir, first thing, to produce a male heir, to produce only, forgive me, I'm going to use the word only a woman. I shall be recancelled the moment well, no, it'll be fine because we don't know what a woman is anymore, so it's absolutely fine to say he only produced a woman. So he only produces a let's get this right, he only produces a biological woman. He only produces the Princess Mary. He then spends a great deal of time trying to make it possible for Mary to inherit. Can we all get this straight again? It is Henry VIII who is directly responsible for female empowerment. Henry is the only king who makes it possible for women to inherit the throne of England. No woman inherits the throne of England before Henry. Everyone's going to say Matilda. Matilda does not inherit. They try to make Matilda queen. Matilda is so awful and is so arrogant that the people of London refuse to allow her to be crowned, and instead, therefore, she's known simply as the Lady of the English, because in those days you required a coronation before you actually recognized as a monarch. Henry, by his decision to place his two daughters in the succession, is the individual who gives women the status to inherit the crown. And what he did has never, ever been reversed. But why does he do it? He does it because of complete accident. The failure, on the one hand, to produce the male heir that he desperately wanted with Catherine of Aragon, and the second, the business of male passion, what we can describe as the Hancock effect, where the stress is on the last syllable. And the folly of most heterosexual men. Remember, women, we've been told a great deal of nonsense about Aphra Behn being the person who first enables women to speak their mind. On reading my Bible, I came to the conclusion that Eve had spoken her mind rather vigorously, and with, of course, predictably disastrous consequences. But that's another matter. But what we get is Henry VIII seduced by Anne Boleyn, and the determination to marry her, which entails the absolute rupture. We've talked about Ivan the Terrible, the burning of monasteries, Ivan's own sense of a kind of Caesaro-papism, a belief that he himself is both Tsar, he's both emperor and high priest. Well, Henry VIII comes to that conclusion to enable him to carry through his divorce, which, ladies and gentlemen, is the first Brexit. The reason, so this is not being funny, it's not being humorous. The second Brexit would not have happened apart from Henry VIII. What Henry VIII does with look at it, the break with Rome. What is it that founds the EU? It is the Treaty of Rome. The EU is directly analogous to the Catholic Church of the late Middle Ages and the early modern period. It is essentially a supranational organization with its own system of law, its own system of taxation, its own separate language, Latin, its own separate high elite that pervades those kind of values. And what Henry VIII does is to lead the first successful national rebellion against it. And I remember vividly when I was a boy, curiously enough, my background, north of England, working class, whatever, grammar school, my first school trip, we had such things in those days, my first school trip was to Rome. The look of horror on my poor mother's face, a northern working class Puritan. She couldn't explain to me what she really felt about it, which I'm afraid even after dinner would be unmentionable in polite company, but she put it to me rather beautifully. She said, "David, remember, wash your hands thoroughly. They have very peculiar toilet habits," which, of course, these were still the dates of the stand-up lavatories, you know. And that is the reflection of the extraordinary way that Henry VIII, with that first Brexit, with the break with Rome, turns the Channel, from which we are only a few miles away, into the widest strip of water in the world, on either side of which people do things differently. The very meaning of the words public interest reverses on either side. That is Henry. I remember on the vote of the eve of the announcement of the referendum, going to bed convinced that my life's work had been finished. It was over. The reign of Henry VIII at last had come to an end. We were about to ratify our place within the European Union. And then I got up the following morning and realized the old bugger was still alive. So we are still, I'm being deadly serious, we are still there. So that's the first reason. It's very important because, again, look at the Ukraine. We have had this sense of absolute, confident, separate national identity for 500 years. Not disputed, not challenged, indisputable, established, rooted in literature, ideas, and our own institutions. Totally different. Point one. Let's go look at something else that follows from that, from this rupture from the great international institution of the Roman Church. The second thing that Henry does is, which again is so infinitely conspicuously lacking in the Ukraine, he defines frontiers. Something we've forgotten. I had a rather unpleasant set to with Natalie Elphick on this exact subject quite recently. The first duty of any nation is to defend its frontier, as the Ukrainians know bitterly to their cost. What Henry VIII does is, again, we take this too easily for granted. We are told, we are fed this myth that England was never invaded after 1066. Remember, again, can we just also get these points absolutely straight? What Ukraine is going through now is exactly what England experienced in 1066, which is a brutal foreign conquest. It's exactly what Putin wanted to do to the Ukraine. You deliberately decapitate a nation. You remove its king, you remove its aristocracy, you remove its intelligentsia, you remove its church. That's what William the Conqueror did. We tend to think of the Norman conquest now as the equivalent of a slightly rougher version of a year in Provence. It was not. It was not. Norman castles were symbols of occupation. The cathedrals crushed the faces of the poor. They were built by forced labor. Anglo-Saxons were in fact, slaves within their own country. There was a system of exactly what you would expect, Nazi-like system of reprisal. If you killed a Norman, an entire village was wiped out as penalty, right? That's what it was. Very much what Putin would have wished to have achieved. But with Henry, we're 500 years on. Henry VIII lies exactly midway between us and the Norman conquest. But what we've got to remember in that whole intervening period between the Norman conquest and Henry VIII, England, although it is an island, if you have an island without serious naval defenses, you are peculiarly prone to invasion. Throughout the Middle Ages, every single change of dynasty is the result of a foreign invasion. The Tudors themselves, 1485, are the result of a French invasion. Henry, Earl of Richmond, is a creature of the court of Charles VIII. His invasion of England is financed by the French court because Richard III was intervening in the disputed land of Brittany. And therefore, the French Regency of Charles VIII throws money into Henry Earl of Richmond's hands. And the fleet that sails to England in 1485 with the future king that conquers at Bosworth, that fleet is French. The money that pays for it is French. The crack troops are French. The reason that Henry VII, Henry Earl of Richmond, survives the charge of Richard III at Bosworth is because he had professional French troops who were trained in the new techniques of using the pike. Again, the famous description of Richard III charging down Hamilton Hill at Bosworth, the last charge of a medieval king, wearing his crown, his battle armor, with his household knights around him. The only reason that Henry VII, not yet Henry VII, Henry Earl of Richmond and his standard bearer Thomas Brandon, Brandon's killed, the only reason that Henry survives is that he has French professional troops who are used to using the pike, which is you kneel down with this vast, long 20-foot spear and horses impale themselves on it. That's the only reason he survived. So he's got French troops, and the only person who gets a peerage out of Bosworth is a Frenchman, right? So up to Henry VIII, we are part of Greater France. The 100 Years' War is an internecine war between a dynasty which is both English and French, which is why the French have to introduce the rule of what's called, to introduce the rule of the Salic law, which prevents the succession of a woman or anybody as an heir of a woman. Otherwise, Edward III and Henry V would have been king of France. So what you do is you then separate England from France by doing what? Henry VIII uses the vast resources that have been acquired by the dissolution of the monasteries, again, echoes of Ivan the Terrible and the dreadful things he did to the monasteries of Novgorod. He uses the wealth of the monasteries to do two things: to fortify the whole of the English frontier from the northeast, from Newcastle on Tyne, Henry VIII who builds the Newcastle, and Hull, the whole of the way round, all those extraordinary round, squat, very like Henry VIII, round, squat, thuggish little castles that we have round here, Walmer, Deal and whatever. They're nasty things, aren't they? They really are. They're gun platforms. And what they do is they go the whole of the way round along Cornwall, along Penzance, right up to Milford Haven. And what they're designed to do, they're placed actually by Henry VIII as a result of the cartography which he sponsors to create a defensible frontier to England. And we've got the actual maps which he marks in his own hand. It's him doing it, this vast amount. So you create England which is defended by an actual physical stone and gun emplacements. And they're so well placed, of course, many of them are reused in the Second World War and so on. The actual calculation of protect, because England is covered in harbours. We have many of the world's best harbours, which means in the Middle Ages, as I said, every single change of dynasty is the result of an invasion from continental Europe. So you fortify England, and then secondly, you fortify England with not only a stone wall on land, with a wooden wall on sea. You actually begin the creation of a serious navy. Now, this is unthinkable in the world of the Ukraine. It's unthinkable with Russia. It's why there is this perpetual debate about buffer states. It's why there's this perpetual debate about zones of influence, because you have no frontier. You have this vast sweeping steppe, which is the land on which, of course, a terribly large part of our corn and grain is grown. Watch your chicken prices rise rocketingly, because there is no frontier. Henry fixes a frontier. So he divides, he fixes a frontier, and then as part of this extraordinary process of the fixing of a frontier, he does something else. He fixes a language. Have you noticed how similar Ukrainian and Russian are? They slip by the odd vowel. Ukrainian is really just Geordie in Russian. It's no more. What you get under Henry is, we again misunderstand this. It is the moment at which, and remember again, say, England too is a fringe power. We're a fringe European power. We are at the extreme western end of Europe. They're at the extreme eastern end of Europe. Under Henry, what you get is that this language, and again, Russian in some ways is a new language with its new strange alphabet. English, do we all not realize this? English is a very new language. How old is it? It's no older than Chaucer. All the stuff about Anglo-Saxon is deliberately decapitated as a language by the Normans. When you remove the intelligentsia of Anglo-Saxon England, Anglo-Saxon stops being a written language. Anglo-Saxon ceases to be a written language within 100 years of the Norman conquest. And instead, what it becomes is grunt. It becomes peasant grunt. Can we just again assess accurately our national origins? The Battle of Hastings, we actually know the war cries. The war cries of the Norman knights of William the Conqueror are, because French is already a stable language, a stable Latinate language, the battle cries of the Norman knights of William the Conqueror are Dieu aide, God help us. What is the battle cry of the housecarls of Harold, King of England? Oot, 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 out, 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 like Arthur Scargill and his miners. It is exactly the same. It is exactly the same. And what you see in the late Middle Ages is, with Geoffrey Chaucer at the end of the 14th century, is this astonishing fusion of what had happened to Anglo-Saxon. It becomes simply a peasant dialect. It loses its grammar. It loses its declensions. It loses its conjugations. It loses its genders. And then it's fused with French. That is what Chaucer does. And then in the England of Henry VIII, an even greater change happens, and it's fused with Latin. We are the most extraordinary language in the world. We are a fusion of 3 languages with virtually no grammar, but just idiom. And that is Henry. All the things we think we happen under Elizabeth, with Shakespeare and whatever, really happen under Henry. The English we use is formed under Henry VIII by William Tyndale's translation of the Bible. The King James Bible, which is 100 years later, at the beginning of the 17th century, all its good bits are Tyndale. All the best bits you remember. The things that you hear in an Obama speech, the things that you hear with Martin Luther King, the thing that you hear when Biden is sane, which is not very often, it is this English of the early 16th century, these magnificent phrases of the King James Bible, which is a kind of formalization and elaboration of the English. In other words, the King James Bible is already using an English which is 100 years out of date, which is using an English which is formal, rhetorical, elegant. designed for public utterance, and of course is magnificently used only a few miles from where we're now standing whenever Robert Willis gets into the pulpit at Canterbury Cathedral. He embodies this. The reason that what he says, many of us heard him yesterday at Nigel van der Bijl's memorial service, the reason his extempore speeches are so wonderful, sermons are so wonderful, is that he is steeped in this English of the reign of Henry VIII, of Tyndale and of Cranmer's Book of Common Prayer. So we have then Henry inventing England as separate from Europe, giving a frontier, settling the nature of the English language, which, by the way, it's for the first time described as a great European language under Henry, given a conscious inheritance from Chaucer, who is actually compared to the great classical origins of Greek and Latin, compared to Homer and to Virgil, and wonderfully written actually by the man who was then the Chancellor of the equivalent of the Chancellor of the Exchequer, how very different from Rishi Sunak, called Brian Tuke, who writes the preface to the first official edition of Chaucer, which is interestingly enough official publication of the King's printer, whilst he's waiting for the turning of the tide at Greenwich. Henry VIII has obviously changed his mind at something, and he's waiting to get back to Whitehall. Which brings us to the next extraordinary thing. Henry VIII is responsible. This again is the vast difference between Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible lays the foundations of Russian autocracy, from which it has never, ever recovered. Do we not realize all of this prattling about democracy? Democracy is a tiny minority movement in the world. 20% of the world's population lives under democracy. Russia has never known it. China has never known it. The Middle East has never known it. Most of Africa has never known it. Most of South America has never known it. Can we not learn to call things by their proper names? Why is it then that this gigantic, effulgent personality of Henry VIII doesn't take us in the same direction as Ivan the Terrible? Why don't we finish up? Because after all, it's exactly the same sort of personality. He was another Putin. Right? That's what they were. Why doesn't it happen? It doesn't happen because under Henry, you already had 500 years of stable government. You already had Magna Carta. You already had the beginnings of Parliament. You already had the structure of the English church. You already had the established English aristocracy. You already had English common law with that. You already had the Inns of Court. You already had Oxbridge and Cambridge. You had an entire network of institutions, none of which existed in Russia. There was nothing. So Henry's personality had to interact with this other world. And what it does, of course, is, of course it interacts. And it interacts in a fashion which I've tried to explain. I'm very interested in using buildings and so on, artifacts, things, as well as words in explaining history. It interacts through the creation of a new palace. The old, why do we now refer, when we talk about Parliament, to Westminster? When we talk about our government, we refer to Whitehall. In Russia, you refer to one thing, which is the Kremlin. There's nothing else. Here, there is this double structure. There is a tension. The person who creates it is Henry VIII. That the old royal palace of Westminster, which is now the site of what we call the Houses of Parliament, throughout the Middle Ages, just like the Kremlin, was the centre of everything. It was there Parliament met, it was there that the king lived, because remember, in those happy days, government only occurred from time to time. What a wonderful thought that would be. It followed roughly the school year, and there wasn't any for the rest of the time. But so you had within the same building, essentially Westminster Hall and 2 or 3 large structures around it. You had the Parliament meeting, you had the King living, you had the Law Court sitting, you had the Exchequer, and you have the Chancery, all in that same space. What happens at the beginning of the reign of Henry VIII is that the old royal palace where the king actually lives burns out. And you are left... Remember, the history of the destruction of buildings is just as important as the creation, as will happen now in the Ukraine with the destruction of cities. Destruction is as important as creation. It's part of that same, if you like, cycle, as in the cycle of a garden. And it's exactly part of that same cycle. So under Henry VIII, at the beginning of his reign, the domestic quarters of the Palace of Westminster are burnt out, and Henry never lives there again, and no other king ever lives there again. And Henry, for the first 20 years of his reign, commutes from Greenwich, which is why Brian Tuke writes his introduction to the first edition of Chaucer whilst waiting for the turning of the tide at Greenwich, because anybody who's ever tried to get from Greenwich to Westminster will know you can't do it, either by London bus, particularly thanks to the dreadful Mayor of London, or by tube or anything else. On the river you can. Henry could get, if he waited for the tide to go in the right direction, he could get from Greenwich to Westminster if the tide is going out, if you've got the ebb tide, or from Greenwich to Westminster if you've got the high tide coming in, running up. You could do it in 35 minutes. You try doing it in 35 minutes now. But then in 1529, with going back to the whole business of the divorce, the fall of Wolsey, Henry seizing Wolsey's great town palace of York Place and renaming it Whitehall. And what he does there, he creates the new instruments of autocratic government. He creates the Privy Council and he creates the Secretaries of State. And of course, in the days when I did history at Cambridge, my dear old tutor, Geoffrey Elton, always used to claim these were the new instruments of bureaucracy. Rubbish. They were the instruments of Henry VIII's brutal power. And when Cromwell decided they would actually interfere with that, well, Henry made sure he was executed by a rather inexperienced executioner, which was not the kind of fate that you would want. But you know what? From that point onwards, we have had a tension between the government of Whitehall and the government of Westminster. When we had the Civil War of the 17th century, it wasn't, as we're constantly told, a struggle between royalist and republican. It was a struggle between two different views of monarchy, one of which is the monarchy of Westminster, the other of which is the monarchy of Whitehall. The monarchy of Westminster is the monarchy of our present Queen. It's the monarchy in which the monarch is silent and is effectively the vehicle of public decency, of the way of doing things, of ordered procedure. Whitehall is all about the rule of personality, the actual individual, the idea of the monarch as the individual driving force of government. And the way we reconcile the two, of course, though it did take us a couple of 100 years of rather intense strife and the odd civil war, was actually to invent two monarchs. So we have Queen Elizabeth II representing decency and order, and we have Boris Johnson representing real power. And Boris Johnson is a monarch. We may not like the fact he's a monarch, and he runs Whitehall in exactly the same way that Henry VIII did. And Carrie Johnson, we call her Carrie Antoinette. It would be much better to call her Cannie Boleyn. She is Cannie Boleyn. And she even managed, unlike the original Anne Boleyn, she even managed to produce the requisite number of children. So we've got to realize Henry actually determines our politics as well. And then a final point, the myth. Henry, the Tudors are the English-Greek myths. Henry VIII is so much better than Bluebeard. Now, Bluebeard is his sort of vainly has anybody ever watched the dreadful, dreadful opera, Bartók's opera? the most boring thing you've ever encountered in your life. There are lots of little things that go on with sort of swirling clouds and empty doors. With Henry VIII, you know the horror. You know the detail. Poor Anne Boleyn, the morning she's about to be executed. There's no misty horror. There's no swirling cloud. We know Anne is told 3 or 4 hours, well, 12 hours, I think it is, before her execution, she will be executed in the novel fashion. Not, I mentioned the huge difference between England and France. There's even the sophistication in the French method of execution. Like a bit like the difference between English and French cooking. The English, you know, you kneel down and some thug comes down and waves up and down a rather heavy axe, which may take 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 attempts to get your head off. In the French Ancien Régime, this is even before Monsieur Guillotine, well, le docteur Guillotine, actually comes up with his neat mechanical device. French execution was completely different. You knelt, and the sword was swung horizontally. And I think it must be the origin of the expression chin up, because you like that. And that process is explained to Anne 12 hours before it's done. And we know her response. Well, at least I have a little neck. That's real horror. These are legends. Again, Mary is a kind of English Medea. You have Elizabeth as the English Virgin Mary. Anybody who is Catholic will forgive me, but that's the kind of role that she has as I would say, born-again virgin. I gather ladies can do that. This is history, a soap opera. It's something that I've enjoyed and thrived on in terms of television presentation. But it's something bigger, ladies and gentlemen. These myths, and they are semi-myths, although there's a real foundation to them, are things that everybody, whatever their origin, whether they come from England, whether they come from Scotland, whether they come from the West Indies, whether they come from India, wherever, can actually buy into. They're big stories. They are national myths. Ukraine doesn't have one. Russia has terrible ones. For me, the moment I suppose, and at the time I didn't really register it, but the equivalent of this kind of occasion, this is 20-odd years ago, when my Elizabeth book came out, and I was speaking in Chicago, the wonderful Chicago Public Library building, huge auditorium. I sort of turned up and sort of sat at the back and thought, will anybody come? And more and more people came. And to my horror, I'll be truthful, large batch of very elegant black women came and sat down in the front row. Am I going to be asked about how many black ladies of honor Elizabeth had? Answer, no. Not a bit of it. They were simply excited by the story, by that extraordinary woman, by her reversal of the prejudices of the time, by her ability, wonderful phrases, like, here there will be no master and one mistress. That, even better, my favourite Elizabeth remark, when Parliament is agitating for her to have a child and saying, if you don't agree to marry, we're going to throw you out. She took one look at them at this grand delegation. Can you imagine? You can't imagine poor Elizabeth II doing it. But can you imagine the speech from the throne? She looks at them hard and says, if you cast me out of the realm in my petticoat, that's my underskirt, I can fend for myself. That magnificence of a history that with the boldness of its personality can embrace, can involve, can excite. We haven't done any of this. We're merely the very fortunate legatees. Thank you.
I'm sure you've got questions. Would you like to come up? Oh, right, you have the fellow in the back.
Yeah.
Right, come up anyway.
No, it can be. They're fine. Trot along. Who would like to kick off? Yeah, gentleman there.
What sort of personality was Henry VIII?
Well, like Ivan the Terrible. Henry, again, there's a huge debate about Henry. Susanna Lipscomb, who is a perfectly decent historian, has come up with this absurd notion that Henry changes because he has a couple of knocks on the head in January 1536, concussion. Well, first of all, the evidence for one of the concussions is extremely weak. It is only a report from a papal agent in Paris having a rather second-hand conversation with Francis I. I think there is a real change in Henry. And remember, Henry VIII's character is sufficiently impressive at the beginning of the reign that Thomas More, who is nobody's fool, thinks that he's the ideal monarch. Right? So that's what you get. The Thomas More writes both verse and prose welcoming Henry, which is in the terms, he actually uses the terms of Christ's coming. What I think happens is that you get this Henry's desire for a son, his lust for Anne, and this is why I made the abusive remark about poor old Matt Hancock, his lust for Anne, and the fact that it is only achievable by tearing apart the entire fabric of institutions of England. His family turns against him. His daughter turns, obviously. Remember, for poor Mary, all this happens to Mary when she's a teenager. You know, can you imagine? Your father repudiates your mother, you are bastardized and whatever. The royal family splits. Henry, again, we don't fully appreciate this. Henry begins by consciously repudiating the persecution of the House of York. He is the first person to have the Tudor badge. This is a complete misunderstanding. Henry VII never uses the Tudor rose. He's Lancastrian, his wife is Yorkist. Henry VIII is the first person who is a descendant of both York and Lancaster. And Henry had consciously reintegrated the House of York and so on. Families like the Earl of Devon becomes Marquis of Exeter, the Greys, Marquises of Dorset and whatever. He integrates them all within the royal house. Unfortunately, they all choose the wrong side. They all choose Catherine of Aragon and Mary as against Anne Boleyn, which is why you get the renewed persecution and the renewed horror. And so Henry's change of character, I think, is extremely simply explained. Henry's divorce lasts from 1527 to 1533. That's 6 years. At a time when life expectancy is 30 odd. That's the change. You fight your way through that, and at the same time, of course, in order to do it, you invoke all the sorts of ideas which Ivan the Terrible is doing. The idea of being an emperor, the idea of the fusion of church and state. Again, I didn't mention, of course, Henry VIII is the person who invents the idea of a national church. Exactly the same kind of role that you see being deployed by the Orthodox Church in Russia. The identification of church and state, the sanctification of brutal and raw power. So he's complicated. He changes. We all change. But it seems to me that again, the mistake that we've been making when we've been talking about Putin is everybody goes, oh, he's got to be mad. That just means he operates according to a different value system from what you do. The key thing about studying history is you learn to engage with people whose value systems are different from yours. The past is different. It's L.P. Hartley. The past is another country. They do things differently. The reason we are misunderstanding and mishandling the Ukraine as completely as we are is that we thought we'd won. We'd thought that Western values had triumphed. Can anybody tell me how many members of the the G20 have actually supported sanctions? 11. 9 haven't. The only ones who've supported sanctions are the Anglosphere. That's really the fusion. Remember, the only person who envisaged the world that we're in accurately is George Orwell. 1984 envisages the world we're in completely accurately. That there will be a Eurasia, which is Greater Russia, that there will be Oceania, which is America and the British Empire fused, there will be China, East Asia, and then there'll be a middle world. What we've done, we've lost the middle world. If you actually look at the people who did not, right, can I list the people who did not agree to sanctions? It's staggering. It is Argentina, it is Mexico, it is Brazil, it is Saudi Arabia, it is South Africa, it is India, it is Indonesia. The whole of the third world is not on our side. We failed. And Russia has won in that sense. Russia redefined a different way of looking at international law. Russia argued, and this is the extraordinary figure of Lavrov, the Soviet minister, the Soviet foreign minister, who is the most brilliant performer, staggering mastery of English, ability to draft complex documents in English and whatever. But he advanced a completely different view of international law, that there is not the one size fits all of the West, the idea you have liberal intervention, humanitarian intervention and whatever. He talked about a system of international law which recognizes each country or each super state, because he really recognizes super states like Brazil, like all the ones I've been listing. Each one of them has the right to determine itself according, not to principles of universal human rights or democracy or humanitarianism, but according to its national, its cultural, and its confessional traditions. That's what the world is. This is why Russia is being supported by Saudi Arabia, why it's being supported by Pakistan. And of course, we failed dreadfully in the policies we pursued in Iraq and Afghanistan. They could say legitimately, West values are simply vehicles for American domination. It's our failure to understand other people being different from us. The idea of going into Afghanistan and, sorry, do we need even further, even with my voice? Right, okay. That even in Afghanistan, the idea that you invade Afghanistan to give women a right to wear miniskirts is deranged and tragic and arouses the most wickedly false expectations. I mean, can't we all recognize we've been fools? But this is what history demands you do. You understand the other side. You don't impose yourself on them. It's why, of course, the whole woke thing is so totally stupid. The past is impervious to you. They're dead. They don't care that you reject them. It's simply performative. It's simply pirouetting with moral virtue. We've to think. It's difficult. Thinking is painful. So this is what I'm trying to say, but you're trying to understand a Henry. You've just got, again, it's the resemblances between Henry VIII and Ivan the Terrible. I wasn't aware. I mean, I suddenly got the idea when I was doing this lecture, I really ought to, Ivan the Terrible reigns in the second half of the 16th century. I thought I really ought to check up. And suddenly he's a mirror image, even down to the number of wives, the music, whatever, but with this radically different consequence. Because of one coming in at the beginning of a state, the other halfway through its story. Gentleman here.
How do you think?
Just hang on for a second, then we've got a microphone.
How do you think we will make sure that Putin gets his comeuppance? And will someone worse come in his place?
You mean than Putin?
Putin.
We can do nothing about it. Again, you see, we are being fools. The United Nations has turned out to be as useless as the League of Nations. And the reason is very simple, that the powers in 1945, the great powers, gave themselves the powers of veto in the Security Council. The second reason, and the thing that we should be doing, and I become more and more aware of this, the people who bear the massive moral guilt of what's going on now are those communist spies in America who gave the Russians the atom bomb. In other words, I'm sorry, but McCarthy was right. There were people, remember, the only reason that you can have the Berlin airlift in 1948-49 is Russia had not yet exploded the atom bomb. The moment you have the atom bomb, you have, with more than one power having it, any notion of moral superiority goes out of the window. Why are we impotent in the face of Putin? I don't know how many of you have got intelligence contacts. I've got a few. The Americans have been running very serious scenarios. And the first place where an atom bomb would go is London. Can we all just register this fact? And the dangers of prattling about, restrictive airspaces and whatever. Again, reread 1984. He got the internal politics wrong. He got the geopolitics absolutely right. You can do nothing. Russia has got more warheads, nuclear warheads, than the rest of the world put together. Again, the talk of arraigning Putin before a criminal court is deranged. International law is meaningless without power. Law is only possible, we've judges here, with power behind it. The time I said this, I remember vividly a few months ago on Ian Dale's show on LBC. I had that left-wing fool, Paul Mason, opposite me, who accused me of being a neo-Nazi power worshipper. It's a simple statement of positive law. We've judges here. Law depends on an agency to enforce it. The concept of international law and human rights was brilliantly described at UCL by the founder of UCL, by Jeremy Bentham, as nonsense on stilts. We've sold ourselves a myth. I'm sorry, it's a total myth. The reason that the Nazis were arraigned in 1945 was they were defeated. We fought an absolute unlimited war. Our war aims from the moment Churchill took over as Prime Minister were German unconditional surrender. You can then talk about war crimes. It's meaningless. You're simply preening yourself. You're draping yourself in virtue, which I think is contemptible. We've got to admit, you're following what I'm trying to say, we've got to admit, fundamentally, international relations are about force. That's the last resort. The tragedy again, we admitted, so Russia and China do not acknowledge our view of international law. India doesn't. Argentina doesn't. Mexico doesn't. South Africa doesn't. They've a different view. And we allowed them into free trade with us, which they use simply to make themselves strong and to make us weak. We've forgotten the nature of force. This again, this is why Churchill is being reviled. Churchill understood the nature of force. There's no point in being good unless you've got a big stick. Otherwise, you're a preacher. You're not a politician. So we can do nothing. We can do nothing. I mean, and again, you see, it seems to me to be so unlikely. I mean, it may happen. Russia may really change. But my view of revolution is revolutions simply reproduce the worst features of the ancien regime. It's why Macron is clearly a mini Louis XIV. France really has not changed. The palaces have got smaller and the high heels a bit lower, and they cease to be red. Am I not right? You know, and again, you look at Xi in China. I mean, he is an emperor. The Chinese Communist Party is equivalent to the Mandarinate. It doesn't change. And you're again the whole world of Islam. I mean, Turkey, which is the other. Sorry, I should have mentioned Turkey. I mean, Turkey. Erdogan aims to recreate the Ottoman Empire. We've decided we don't want empires. Russia hasn't. Turkey hasn't. China hasn't. I don't really think America has. Huh? We've been living in a fool's paradise. And looking at a reign like Henry VIII's, I mean, this surely is the reason that it's such a good teaching vehicle. You can actually see, on the one hand, these wonderful stories, the role of personality, but you also have a sense of real big questions actually being thought over and astonishingly debated in a way that puts us to shame. If you actually look at the articulacy of the way in which the different sides of the Reformation are articulated, the kind of speeches that are made for and against Thomas More, More's own defence of himself at his trial, what strikes you is the sheer awful sloppiness of our public utterance, of the shallowness of our press commentary. What do you expect? We've had easy times. There's been nothing much to fight about. And which is a lovely thing. Don't get me wrong. I wouldn't have wished to have lived in the reign of Henry that I can imagine nothing more horrible, or than living under Putin. But again, look at the superiority of the literature that emerged under communist Russia from what emerged here. The fact that people are confronted with real choices as opposed to the frothing nonsense of the West.
Another question behind here.
Yep.
Dr. Starkey, really enjoyed all you said tonight and your own sort of thoughts. Could I just address you going back to the VIII? Once he's passed, do you feel that the outgoingness of the English at the time was right in exploring the rest of the world as opposed to perhaps concentrating more on conquest of Europe?
Yes, I mean, clearly, the Henry VIII is the opposite. I mean, Henry VIII has no interest in the world outside Europe. The king who may even have envisaged a serious English Atlantic empire is his father, is Henry VII. Henry VII sponsors Cabot, and the signs are that Cabot actually does discover most of Canada. There's some very interesting work being done on this. But then what you get under Henry VIII's daughter, Elizabeth, is this. Henry VIII had developed a notion, we're talking about empire. Henry VIII had developed a notion of empire which really applied to the British Isles. So Henry has himself declared King of Ireland, and he sees himself as consciously sees himself as an emperor of his own dominions. So you've got the crown with the arches over it, you have the throne with the exaggeratedly high number of steps, and all that kind of thing. But when Elizabeth comes to the throne, it's actually proclaimed as her royal title. She's Queen England, France, Ireland, all the rest of it. But she is mistress of the seas, from the Orcades to the Bay of Biscay. You suddenly, and there's this entire, people obscure sort of combinations of necromancers and mathematicians are coming up with this theory of an English empire, which is a seaborne. You're already this very extraordinary notion of a seaborne empire is being developed. And it's all there. And that, of course, is what happens. But you see, there is again, we are facing a crisis of empire, the whole debate about the moral or the otherwise status of the British Empire. What is so peculiar about the British Empire is that it is the first and last empire consciously to imagine its own destruction. In the same way, it is absolutely true that for a period of time, from the Treaty of Utrecht to the rendering illegal of the slave trade, and then the abolition of slavery throughout the world, effectively, is what the decision amounts to in 1833. Britain in the 18th century is briefly the world's leading slave trader. We are the only country consciously to abolish slavery. In the same way, with the Durham Report following in the wake of the collapse of the first English empire in the United States with American independence, the Durham Report consciously introduces the idea of colonial independence. Consciously. And that is then exemplified in the whole way the empire develops in the late 19th century with the granting of Dominion status. And then, of course, in the Statute of Westminster of 1931, which between 1929 and 1931, you create the idea of the Commonwealth. And with the Statute of Westminster, you introduce the notion that all of the colonies will themselves effectively become self-governing. Now that's extraordinary. And again, the legacy of that is, I think, amazing. I mean, none of this is perfect. But if you actually think of a legacy of an empire that creates America, Australia, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, whatever, as its successor states, and creates a Commonwealth that can embrace even India, that can embrace Trinidad, the Barbados, whatever. That is something very, very remarkable. And we need, again, to be looking at our history. I think, again, I happen to be a believer in, as will be clear, in English exceptionalism. But we are peculiar in that our history has, on the whole, resolved its contradictions. There's something very wonderful, talking about things, something very wonderful. If you stand with your back to the National Gallery in London, the top of Trafalgar Square, on your left-hand side, on your right-hand side, I'm never very good at remembering which hand is which. If you look, terrible at giving directions. If you actually, to your right hand, you will have James II, the king who was overthrown in 1688. If you go a few hundred yards in that direction, you come to St. James's Square, where there's the wonderful flamboyant statue of the man who overthrew him, William III. Then if you look south, across Trafalgar Square to the top of Whitehall, you will have Charles I, the king who was executed. And at the bottom, looking up towards him, standing in front of the Houses of Parliament, is Oliver Cromwell, the man who cut his head off. And it's that astonishing, in other words, we are slavers and enslaved. We are Republicans and Roundhead. We are Catholic and Protestant. We are established church and we are dissenter. We are mill worker and we are mill owner. And if you actually contrast that, for example, with German history, everybody goes on about, oh, haven't the Germans been wonderful since the Second World War? I don't think they have at all. Germany never paid reparations. The great German companies like Siemens and whatever thrived on slave labor, have never paid a penny for it. And the Germans did not pull down the Nazis. That was done for them. We pulled down slavery. Our ancestors did. And it seems to me this is the point. And again, can we also just recognize this fact? The idea of international law, of human rights, and democracy is fundamentally Anglo-American. It has no purchase outside that tradition at all. I mean, if you actually look at those 11 members of the G20, it is the Anglosphere, it's the old British Empire and America, and it is the European Union fragmenting before our eyes. And remember, Germany, isn't it wonderful, is still paying $1 billion a day. I mean, our treatment of Russia is deranged. You say, we're going to cut off, it's a bit like a terrible mugging. You see a dreadful mugging. Of course, because you're a bit pacifist and you can't possibly intervene. What you decide to do is cut up the mugger's credit card, but you insist on paying his wages in cash. That's exactly what sanctions amount to. Isn't it true? Isn't that precisely what they amount to?
One more question. Any questions from the back there?
Yes, please. Can we have a microphone back there? Thank you. Yeah. I'm sure they'll be very expert with microphones, yes. Thank you. No, I can't hear. You need to hold it a bit closer.
I want to see how you feel about the suggestion that Henry VIII's legacy would not be anywhere near what it is without the presence of women in his story. For example, his divorce, his loss, as you said, for Anne Boleyn and his female heirs.
Yeah, I've got that. Henry VIII's legacy wouldn't be anything but for the women. That's true, but the women only exist because Henry VIII was interested in them. I'm sorry, this is a brutal fact. It is the only reason we know about Lady Hamilton is because Nelson fancied her. So I've written a huge book on Henry's wives, right? And it's a very good book, as all my books are. But what we need to, one has to understand this. And again, the women have limited agency. The agency which a woman can have, there are specific spheres in which she can have it. I mean, the role of a woman in the 16th century, even a very powerful woman, is essentially, it's within the domestic sphere, which is often very strong. So, remember, women have been exercising power since the Garden of Eden. It really is very important we understand this. I, for many years, was a teacher at LSE, and the founder of LSE, Beatrix Webb, for a long period of time was opposed to female suffrage because she said women can exercise so much more power outside the ballot box because most heterosexual men are like Matt Hancock. Isn't this true? Come on, admit it. Admit it. It really is true. It's called boudoir power. There's a special study of this. Look at the role of the mistresses of French kings. Look at Carrie Johnson. So Henry's wives, some of them do have immense temporary power. But it is essentially through that manipulative role of a man. It's also, of course, because in certain areas like education, like religion, which is why so many women are prominent as saints, why the importance of nunneries, the importance, for example, the upbringing of royal children, apart from the heir, the responsibility for the upbringing of the heir is the king. All other royal children are brought up by their mother. Profoundly important. And repeatedly, of course, again, we've also got to put it the other way around. Women again assume enormously important roles as widows. This is the role, for example, of Henry VII's mother, of Margaret Beaufort. It's why you have Champagne called Veuve Clicquot, the widow Clicquot. Because once a woman ceases to be married, she assumes the right of her own property and ability to control it. When you're married, you're called femme couverte, covered by your chap, who takes over your money and everything else. But once your chap's gone, which is one of the many reasons I think many women were extremely relieved when they were widowed, you take over your property, your own rights and whatever. and so on. So we're dealing in a very, very different world. But what I think is wrong is to see Henry's wives as, I mean, they're part of the wonderful soap opera that I was describing, but I mean, look again at Catherine of Aragon, the wife of the most unimpeachable royal status and whatever. There is a brief moment in the beginning of the reign, and particularly the French War of 1513, when she acts effectively as co-sovereign. She is left as regent in England. Remember, she's been brought up by, in Spain, I mean, Isabella is actual co-regent with her husband Ferdinand. Well, she's co-monarch with her husband Ferdinand. But that's extraordinarily peculiar. When, for example, Henry VIII's daughter, Mary, marries Philip of Spain, it's Philip who is king. The reign becomes Philip and Mary. And the Privy Council reports to Philip, not to Mary. So you've got to be, in other words, the problem is, and I am delighted, I think it's terrific that women assume an independent and freestanding role. I do so, of course, because of the way I was brought up. I had a dominant mother and a really quiet father. Isn't it obvious? And I also had my entire childhood was dominated by women, my primary school mistress, headmistress, my doctors, the physiotherapist who tended me with my club foot, and God knows what else, the wonderful Sister Middleton, who ran the outpatients department. They were all unmarried. And what you forget is, the early 20th century, there were extremely active professional women. They were not married. The great post-war shift is that married women could also assume a public role. So do you see what I mean? You've got to be this general term of, oh, women are feisty or whatever. Never use that word. It's dreadful. You have to look at them in the actual circumstances of the time. So Catherine, the first Catherine, Catherine of Aragon, when there's war, when she's left as regent, she's brilliant at organising things. Similarly, right at the end of the reign, Catherine Parr, who'd actually been named after Catherine of Aragon, her father was vice-chamberlain to Catherine of Aragon. Catherine Parr, when Henry goes off to fight in France in 1544, she's left in exactly the same position as regent. She's extraordinarily good at it. And interestingly enough, Elizabeth, Princess Elizabeth's first experience of the court is when she's brought to court under Catherine Parr and actually sees a woman acting as boss of the court and all the nobles of the court and the privy councillors bending their knee to them. But you have to do it very specifically. You have to be aware of the specific circumstances and the specific moment. And you've also to be aware of the sheer terror of being married to Henry. That famous moment when Anne Boleyn remonstrates with Henry on something or another, and that whiplash reply, she stood where her betters had done. Or very similarly with Jane Seymour, a terrible reminder what's gone before. So we in other words, you cannot reflect back on the empowerment of women now. You have to look at, as I said, the gender role, which is, in other words, the general ease with which any woman who knows what she's doing can get any heterosexual man around her little finger in 10 seconds. I mean, that's part of the story. But we're talking about a public stage and a public performance, and areas where you're allowed to do it, areas where you're not allowed to do it, and above all, dependency on, going right back to the point I made about Ivan the Terrible, about an absolute power that can make you like that.
Brilliant.
I'm very glad that we finished on Ivan the Terrible, because I've had an inspiration. His first words, my cockerel, the old cockerel, is called Attila the Hen. The new, thrusting young cockerel is going to be called Ivan the Terrible. So this has meant a lot to me. David, as ever, fantastic, controversial. It makes you feel that every idea you've ever had or think you've had has been turned over, eviscerated, and come out as something quite different. It makes you think, and it has been an extraordinary evening. So, David, thank you so much for giving your time for this huge cause of the Ukraine. And I think your first words tonight have shown us just how strongly you feel about it and represented just how strongly we feel about it. So thank you so much, and perhaps we can give him a huge round of applause for standing up.
Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for watching David Starkey Talks. If, as I very much hope, you're enjoying them, why not become more actively involved and join my members club? As a member, you'll be able to take part in the members-only weekly question and answer session, suggest topics for forthcoming videos, and have priority booking for my forthcoming live events. And while you're at it, why not have a look at the store page on my website, davidstarkey.com. There you can purchase t-shirts and other merchandise, buy signed copies of my books, and, if you're feeling brave and a bit flush, even arrange to take me out to lunch. Thank you once again for watching. I look forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to my members club.